Unless you're going out with the kids.
All right, jumping back in the book of Hebrews, we finished looking at our little intermission of warning. Not really a pleasant intermission. I guess intermissions are usually to take a rest. This was really kind of a pointed warning and a little bit of a rebuke, but we're getting back to the main point. And so we're in chapter 7. We're going to look at verses 1 through 10. And chapter 7 represents yet another difficult text. In fact, this entire chapter is just a very, very difficult chapter. But as difficult as it is, it's also one of the most fascinating chapters. And in reality, it's about as fascinating as it is intimidating. And so there's a lot to dig in. And it's all because it revolves around using one person as an example and a comparison. Really, it's a type-antitype situation, the shadow for the real kind of situation. That's what we're talking about when we mean type-antitype. And the man's name is Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek just is a big question mark in so many people's minds. And really, as we read through here, we can glean a little glimpse here and there of who this guy was. And we'll look at the background of where he's first mentioned in Genesis 14. But in reality, we are 2,000 years removed from this ancient rabbinical teaching. And we'll look at some of that and why this individual was used in chapter 7 as an example. And that becomes extremely fascinating. At least to me, it's extremely fascinating because as obscure as this Melchizedek dude is, to the early audience, he wasn't at all. And so it would be as if someone is using Davy Crockett or one of our American legends as an example. And we'll look at some of that as well today. But we're tonight. But we're going to look at the first 10 verses, and we'll go ahead and read those now, and then we'll dip into the text. And really tonight, what we're wanting to do is to see who is Melchizedek, why is he being used here, and why compare him? How is his priesthood like the priesthood of Jesus? And so that's kind of the roadmap where we're going. So Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 7, it reads, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithe from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him." Okay, as we kind of come up a little bit for fresh air and just kind of relax and kind of ease into this text, these chapters are talking about, we're going to, starting here, we're going to start talking about Melchizedek, then we're going to the tabernacle, then we're going to look at the Old Covenant and the heavenly sanctuary and blood sacrifices. And in reality, these are all details that are being used to flesh out one main idea. You know, if we get too lost in details, sometimes we miss the forest for the what?
Trees.
For the trees. What we're reading about, what we're looking at over the next few weeks are trees, and we don't want to miss the forest. We don't want to miss the main point, because our author from this point on in this second half of the book has one main point. And that is that you and I as Christians have a faithful and merciful high priest. And what all of these details are adding to that is that this merciful and faithful high priest was promised, he is permanent, and he is perfect. That's the main point in all of this. And so let's do our best not to lose that main point as we're digging into the shrubs and looking at all of these details, trying to flesh that point out. That's the main purpose. That's the main idea that the author is getting across. Now, Melchizedek, this isn't the first time he's mentioned in the book. He's mentioned in chapter 5. And he's reintroduced in that last verse of chapter 6, right before and directly after our little interlude, where he calls his audience a bunch of spiritual babies, and you better grow up before you ruin everything and drift away yourself. That's what we're doing. And so he's now going back to his point. He's kind of stopped, said, whoop, hey, you guys need to grow up. Okay, let's get back to it. And so we're back to this whole idea of Melchizedek. And now we're going to elaborate. What does it mean that Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek? What does he mean that in the idea of an eternal high priest? Now, in Hebrews 5, if you remember those first 10 verses from a few weeks back, I guess about 4 weeks ago, we were looking at, in Hebrews 5, 1 through 10, all of the qualifications that Jesus had for being priest. What qualified him as being priest. And that's really the conversation that we're picking up here. We're picking that up here. So we're resuming that idea. Now, what we've got to do is to get on the same page as the first century audience. And that can be difficult sometimes. 2,000 years later, completely different culture, completely different backgrounds, different outlooks, different situations. But we need to go back to the beginning. And that's what the Hebrew author does in those first few verses. He's going to kind of recite the story very generally for the audience, but he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail because his audience doesn't need it. And we'll see why in just a little bit. Genesis 14 is our background here. Genesis 14. So, who remembers what's happening in Genesis 14? Who are we dealing with? It's kind of a neat story.
Abraham.
We're dealing with Abraham, and Abraham turns into this kind of warrior, kind of gladiator guy all of a sudden. I mean, I would love to see and know the details of everything that went on during this war. Technically, this is the First World War. I mean, it's really kind of a neat situation that's going on. But basically, and just very, for time's sake, just very generally, Abraham learns about Sodom. Now, who's been living in Sodom? Lot and his family. So Abraham has roots in Sodom. And Sodom is there, and Sodom has been ransacked by some people, and Lot is now a prisoner of war. He's been taken. And so he's hauled off as a prisoner of war. So Abraham does what Clint Eastwood would have done and got a posse together. And he got a bunch of people together, and they rode off, and they're going to go back and get his family. He's going to liberate Lot from the captives. And when Abraham returns, that's when he meets Melchizedek. Now, of course, they're completely successful in this endeavor. They have all the spoils. And here he meets Melchizedek, who is king of Salem. Salem will go on in history to become Jerusalem. And so all of these little bits and details really come into play later, and you see how all of these things are connected. But Melchizedek, king of Salem, comes out and he greets Abraham. He gives Abraham a blessing. And then Abraham, in response to that, because he's been honored by Melchizedek, he turns around and honors him, pays tribute to him by giving him a tenth of all the spoils from the rescue mission that just took place. And so that's the background. And really, in Genesis, that's it. You don't ever hear about Melchizedek again. You don't hear about him before. And yet this individual becomes legendary in the history of the Jews. And again, we'll look at that in just a little bit. But the author, in giving us this, showing us this, wants us to be very, very impressed with the significance. And he focuses on Melchizedek's name and Melchizedek's title in the text. Now, his name Melchizedek, it's a compound word, 2 words smashed together in one. It's from the Hebrew Melech and then Sedek. Melech, Sedek. And the meaning, Melech means king, Sedek means righteousness. King of righteousness. Now, right off, where does your mind go when you think of king and righteousness? Jesus. And so there's this built-in connection here. Now, not only is his name significant to the author, and he wants us really to zoom in, put it under the microscope and get it all nice and focused in. Not only that, but also his title. He was king of Salem. Who knows what Salem means? It's in the text, but just listen to the words Salem, Shalom. What does that mean? Peace. Peace. So here is the king of righteousness, king of peace. Again, that description, who's it pointing to? It's pointing to Jesus. So here's Melchizedek, and our author says his name, king of righteousness, his title, his position, king of peace. And so these concepts of righteousness, the concepts of peace, they're all prefiguring the Messiah, the one who would make righteousness and peace possible for God's people. Now, let's talk about Melchizedek and why use him. And we were really, one of the best, most intriguing, and most important archaeological finds, biblically speaking, were the scrolls at Qumran. We know them as the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1970, they were finally finished being translated and studied and published. And it changed a whole lot what we knew about these ancient cultures. And that's going to come into play when we think of Melchizedek. And now here's just this general description, and to us, it's very quizzical, isn't it? I mean, here's this weird name, and this person who's barely mentioned, not even really a full chapter about him, just a portion of a chapter. He seems like a little side character that you wouldn't really pay any attention to. He's brought back up once or twice in the Psalms, and now he's brought up here. Why in the world this man? Surely there's something that would fit better. But the truth is, the author here would have not had to shake them to get their memories going about Melchizedek. Because these first century Jewish Christians, what the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us is that Melchizedek is just this object of fascination to the Jewish people. Why? I don't know, but something about him became just an object of focus, of fascination to the Jewish people. And not just fascination, but speculation. There were a lot of guesses, a lot of legends, and a lot of myths that surrounded this man, Melchizedek. And so we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. In one of those scrolls, a legend is told where Melchizedek, and a lot of this was rabbinical teaching, a lot of this was kind of just fantasy. But again, it gives us an idea of the culture. But one scroll portrayed Melchizedek as an angel. And actually one who would play a significant role in the end-time judgment. Another scroll had this legend of Melchizedek as a child being rescued from the flood by the archangel Michael and then taken up to paradise. And in paradise, he serves as a priest forever. Just another legend. There were other documents that identify Melchizedek as actually being Michael the archangel, claiming that he is the highest archangel and he's in charge of all of the heavenly priesthood. And so here are all these legends about this guy. He was a known name, just like we have legends in our culture that we say we know. When you speak of a historical figure turned legend, let's say George Washington, what do you know about him? He cannot tell a what? A lie, because of the old cherry tree. It's a complete legend. But again, it's just kind of engraved into our consciousness as a culture. And so that's how Melchizedek was to these Jewish Christians 2,000 years ago. He was a significant figure in their legends. And yet here, the author brings him up and goes back through the biblical story of Melchizedek, kind of setting them, giving them a foundation of what's coming next. And so these Hebrews of the first century, they would have known exactly who he meant. They would have been familiar, and to varying degrees they would have been familiar with this guy. And they would also have been very, very cognizant of the speculation that centered around Melchizedek. And so we know that from our legends, American legends and such. And so when you look back at the account, Melchizedek seems to come out of nowhere. And just as he comes out of nowhere, he goes away. He's there, he appears, he disappears. He's there, he's not there. And he's never mentioned again in Genesis. It's like he just, you see a falling star at night. It's there, it goes, and it's done. It's actually a meteor, just kind of going across the sky. It's there 1 minute, gone the next. And that's how Melchizedek just kind of appears and disappears in Scripture. And so his sudden appearance and disappearance begins his first kind of description and allusion. He's alluding to this when he says in verse 3, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Now, he's not saying he's this mythical character. He's not buying into the myth or feeding into that. He's not calling Melchizedek some kind of divine figure. No, he is a flesh and blood person. And even though that would have been debated at their time, he's not buying into that debate. Our author here is using an argument from silence. He's using an argument from silence to present Melchizedek as a different kind of priest. He was a very different kind of priest. He wasn't like the Levitical priesthood. He was different. If no mention of his parents or his family is made in Scripture, then it's logical for us that Melchizedek held his office by virtue of something other than his birthright or his lineage. His priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek was by virtue out of a calling. Jesus is presented as being called to be a priest in chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. In contrast, the Levitical priests had to have what? What did they have to back up their
lineage?
They had to have a lineage. They had to have genealogical proof. That did not sound like a real word, but let's make it one. They had to show by their lineage a right to serve. And so for our author, this divergence, it establishes Melchizedek's priesthood as being greater than the Levitical priesthood. And so in verses 4 through 10, Melchizedek's superiority to Abraham and to the Levitical priesthood or Levi is emphasized here. In verse 4, he says, "See how great this man was." And so he's inviting us to look at how great Melchizedek is, and he's going to give us 3 reasons. 3 reasons why Melchizedek was so great. The first reason he gives is because he blesses Abraham. He blesses Abraham. Now, when the Jews thought of Abraham, what did they think of? How did they feel about Abraham?
Father.
Yeah, it was their father. He held the what? He was the first one to receive the what? The promises. Yeah, he's the father of their faith, right? Yeah.
In order to avoid confusion, because I think a lot of people get confused, this Melchizedek existed long before the Mosaic law.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not at the same time.
Oh, no.
So this is before the law of Moses was even established.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's going to come into play a little bit later on in the section when he talks about the being superior to Levi himself. But here he's showing Abraham. He blesses Abraham. Now Abraham is the one who received the promises. Abraham is the father of of the Israelites, father of the Hebrews. Moses was the father of their religion, but Abraham, they viewed Abraham as something extremely special. And he says that Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Abraham was known as the Prince of God. Isaiah 41 calls him a friend of God. And yet here is Melchizedek greater, superior, because he blesses Abraham. And he gives the reason in the text. The superior always blesses the inferior. And so when Melchizedek blesses Abraham, it shows Melchizedek to be superior. And that would have been startling. If they had never realized that before, if that was the first time hearing that ever, that would have it's like cold water in the face. Startling. Because of their deep reverence for Abraham. But he was important enough to bless Abraham, and he's blessing Abraham, who they considered the most blessed human being ever to live. Now, second reason, the Israelites gave their tithes to mortal men. What did every single Levitical priest have in common? Where did they end up? In the grave. Every single one of those Levitical priests ended up in the grave. But the author here says Abraham paid tithes to a priest. And in verse 8, this priest lives. Now what we need, our author argues that what we need is a living priesthood. That's his argument. That's where he's going with all this. And Melchizedek is pointing to Jesus, who is the resurrected one. And so basically the question begins, do you want to attach yourself to priests who die, or do you want to attach yourself to a great high priest who has conquered death and lives forever? Now the third thing he points to is that the Israelites paid tithes to the Levitical priesthood as a form of honor. You go back to Numbers 18, you go back to Nehemiah 10, it talks about how that these tithes were a form of honor. And in verses 9 and 10, he makes the point here that technically this priesthood paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham paying tithes to Melchizedek. The father of the nation is paying tithes to Melchizedek. Therefore, Levi, who comes from the father of the nation, is paying tithes through Melchizedek because Levi is still in Abraham's loins. And so, because of that, the order of Levi, that Levitical priesthood, must be inferior to the order of Melchizedek. Now, all of this is to point and to flesh out this idea that Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So first off, out of those three things, you see that the priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. And Jesus is after this order, this more superior, the order of a more superior priesthood. But how? What does it mean to say that Jesus is after the order, is a priest after the order, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek? And again, it gives us three reasons throughout the text. But before we get to the three reasons, I want to suggest we do something. Again, it might help if we invert the question. If we'll invert the question and see instead Melchizedek as a high priest after the order of Jesus, the Son of God. And the reason I say that, putting ourselves in the shoes of the first century audience, he's using something familiar to describe something unfamiliar or new. And the familiar that he's using is Melchizedek. They understood who he was. They understood the backstory. They understood these things. And he's taking what they understand in order to explain something new, the priesthood of Jesus. With us 2,000 years removed, it's completely opposite. We have barely an idea who Melchizedek was, but we have a better understanding of the high priesthood of Jesus. And so it can help us see this balance of an equation that he's setting out there if we will invert that. And looking at the points that he's making about the high priesthood of Jesus can help us fill in the high priesthood of Melchizedek so that we can see clearly the points that he's trying to make. Does that make sense? Am I with you? Am I with you? Are you with me? I'm with you. Are you with me? What's that line in Superman? You've got me, but who's got you? You know? Okay. So that's what we're going to try to do. And so, direction of thought becomes important here. Because the Son of God is not like Melchizedek, but Melchizedek is like the Son of God. And so this comes from Psalm 110 and verse 4. And this is the only New Testament writer that uses this as this prophecy for the high priesthood of Jesus. No other writer deals with this. And again, Jesus is high priest. This is unique to Hebrews. And that's what makes this a little difficult as we try to run into all of these things. And so the author is trying to explain to his audience this unknown concept using an understood one. If we revert that, we might get that understanding. We might get his point a little bit easier. So back to our question. Okay? How is Christ a high priest after the order of Melchizedek? Okay, three things. First of all, Christ is like Melchizedek in terms of order and rank. Order and rank. Now, Melchizedek is the very first priest mentioned in all of the Bible. He's the very first one. First priest mentioned in Scripture. And his priestly order is therefore superior to Levi's because it comes first, chronologically speaking. But Melchizedek's priesthood was also first in rank. What do you think of when you think of someone's rank?
Army.
You think of the army, right? You have the general, the corporal, lieutenant, private, captain, admiral is Navy. I don't know. But you get that. You're talking about rank. It's your position and your importance of that position. When you think of a general, who are you thinking of? Someone high up. He's the man. When you think of a private, peeling potatoes in the mess hall because he didn't salute right? Okay, so Melchizedek's priesthood was first in rank. What was Melchizedek's rank? King, as well as what? Priest. King and priest. So his rank is superior because he's both priest and king. In contrast, how many kings of Israel held the position of priest? None. Absolutely none. And so here's Melchizedek. He's first in order. He comes first chronologically. But he's also first in rank because he is king and he's also priest. But even more, what was he the king of?
Righteousness and peace.
Righteousness and peace. It's in his name and it's in his place, isn't it? Melchizedek, righteousness, king of Shalom, peace, Salem. And so he's king of righteousness and peace. And so here's Christ after the order of Melchizedek. What rank does Christ have? Top. But he reigns as what? He's high priest and he reigns as king. King and priest. Who's able to bring righteousness and peace to his people? Jesus. And so he's after the order of Melchizedek because he is first. He's primary as the Son of God, the supreme Son of God, but also his rank of king and high priest. One who brings righteousness and peace to his people. Okay, that's number one. Number two. Christ is after the order of Melchizedek. He's a high priest after the order of Melchizedek in that he does not have a priestly lineage. What tribe did Jesus come from? Judah. Does the Old Testament say anything about a Judean being a priest? All priests were to come from where? Levi. In fact, that's specifically brought up here in a little bit. And it's a good verse to talk about the authority of the silence of Scripture. But he holds his office by God's appointment. God appointed Jesus, not by genealogy, but by God's appointment. When you go to verse 3 and you read about Melchizedek, and he says he is without father or mother or genealogy, in the Greek it reads so weird and stilted. It's literally motherless, fatherless, genealogy list. Just those 3 words, just blanket statements. And the phrase that it uses in the Greek and the way it's worded there, it's almost a slur. But it also has an implied divine status. And the divine status that it's implying isn't going to Melchizedek. Who's it going to? It's going to Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we've got to say, well, wait a minute. Because how many times do we read about the genealogy of Jesus? Twice. Do we ever read about an earthly mother, father of Jesus? We do. So how is this comparison to be made then? Jesus of Nazareth had an earthly stepfather in Joseph. He had an earthly mother in Mary. And we read in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3 his genealogy. We've got to step back and remember the context in which Hebrews has placed us. For the first 4 chapters of Hebrews, it's setting up that Jesus is superior because of his sonship. He is the supreme Son of God. And as the supreme Son of God, when was he born?
He wasn't.
Ah.
Alpha and Omega.
He was in existence before creation. He pre-existed before everything, and he's going to outlast everything. And so as the Son of God, as the supreme Son of God, the second person of the Godhead, his earthly lineage has zero, no bearing whatsoever on his heavenly priesthood. So number 3, Jesus is a high priest like Melchizedek. What's the time? No, we're not doing that bad. Jesus is a high priest like Melchizedek because he is eternal. Now, we already said it once. I'm going to underline it, put it in bold. What happened to every single Levitical priest? They died. They ended up rotting in a grave somewhere. Aaron, first high priest. When Aaron died, his garments, the priestly robes that he would wear in the big to-dos that they would do, that's by the way the technical term, the to-dos they would do. Those priestly robes got passed on. Who was the high priest after Aaron? This is deep trivia here. This is like not even double jeopardy. This is final jeopardy stuff. Anybody remember? It's the same name as the adopted son of Abraham. Eleazar. And so Aaron dies, all of his priestly garments are passed on to Eleazar. Now, that tells us something, that the high priesthood was going to be perpetual. It was going to keep on going. That was the intention. So the priesthood itself would be perpetual. It would keep on going, but the priests, the humans, would only serve temporary, and the priests themselves would not. Does that make sense? The office was to be perpetual, but the priests themselves would not be, because they're human. They're going to die. And so Aaron, Eleazar, none of their descendants ever served as high priest forever. And so that makes that phrase we get in verse 3, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, that makes this particularly striking. And again, this phrase was usually reserved to describe divine status. Now, the divine status isn't being described or isn't being put on Melchizedek. Who's it being put on? Christ. Jesus has that divine status. And so, basically, you would use that as a reference for God. And so now this kind of begs the question as we kind of close out here. Did our author imply, or is he trying to imply, that Melchizedek of Genesis was a divine being rather than human? And unequivocally, no. It's funny how people will take that. And you know, if you want to be very, very fair, you can kind of see how people would take that and misunderstand that or misapply these things. Because it's a lot of pieces. And you have a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and you don't necessarily have the puzzle box to put the pieces together to. And so, okay, there's going to be some misunderstandings along the way, but we've got to understand why he's using this man. Because he's making an argument, and this is vital, he's making an argument from the silence of Scripture. It goes back to this whole thing that we're going to see over and over again from here on out, of the type-antitype. What are we talking about type-antitype? We've discussed it generally before, but we haven't really gotten into it.
The real thing in the shadow.
The real and the shadow. The sun shines on an object and you see a shadow on the... There's no shadows in here. You see a shadow on the ground, and let's say you go and you get an ice cream cone. Everybody loves an ice cream cone on a hot summer day, and you have that ice cream cone in your hand and the sun's beating down and you want to take a bite of the ice cream cone and you have it here, but then you see a shadow of it here. What's going to taste better? Licking the shadow or the real thing? You see what I'm saying? It may look like it, give you an idea, but where are all the details? The details are in the real. And so when we're talking about type, antitype, we're talking about shadow versus real thing. The type is just the shadow that's there, that it doesn't really have all the details, but it looks like it and it points you to it. Have you ever gone cloud watching? And you see a cloud and you say, oh, that looks like a turtle. And this cloud looks like a... Well, what are you talking about? You don't see a green cloud with slimy little things that get scared and pokes its head in, right? It's just a general shape or outline of it that resembles, it makes you think of it. And so when we're talking about these types and antitypes, those types just make us think of the real thing. They're a form of it. They resemble it for a purpose to help us understand, but they resemble it. But the real thing, that's where all the substance is, right? And so Melchizedek is a shadow. He's a type. And who's the real thing? Christ. Christ is the real thing. And that's why in verse 3, he says, that very last clause in the sentence, he says, well, he is without father or mother genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but, and what's the next word? Resembling, looking like, resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. And so, what's really neat about all of this, just to end on, and I think this is kind of neat. You might think, why is he bringing this up? But this is kind of neat to me. Up until now, when he's comparing and contrasting Jesus with angels, and he did so with Moses, and he did so with covenant, he does it in such a way that he treats them as rivals. If you go back and read those first 4 chapters again, he's treating them as rivals. Because his point is that Jesus is superior to all of these. And so he's treating them as rivals. But here with Melchizedek, he's contrasting Melchizedek with Jesus, but he doesn't see him as a rival to Jesus. And you would think if he was putting them together as rivals in this contrast, that he would start to downplay him, but he doesn't do that. In fact, Hebrews, as a letter, it really extols Melchizedek. But it doesn't extol or lift Melchizedek up for Melchizedek's sake. He does so to convey to us, 2,000 years later, as well as his original audience, he does so to show the greatness of the Son of God, the one whom he prefigures, the one whom he is simply a shadow of. Any questions, comments? What was that middle thing again? Anything?
So no father, no mother, no etc. is a reference to the fact that he had no recorded genealogy, including his parents, descendants, or other such things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that he just popped into existence.
No, absolutely, yeah. He was a man. He had family somewhere, but his priesthood isn't based on his family. And that was the whole point. And that's the whole point of the silence, which is explained here, which is what brought all of that legend into play over for however many, 1,500 years, if not longer, on who this guy is. His family didn't need to be mentioned because he's a priest called of God, not a priest after some genealogy, or his position doesn't come from who mom and daddy is. Makes him special. Richard, were you going to say something? Thought you started to.
Too big.
Okay. All right. Well, if there may be one here tonight who needs to obey the gospel, we want to give you that opportunity. And maybe one here who because of whatever struggles you're experiencing, problems, whatever it be, you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters in Christ. We want to do that. We want to help you in any way we can right now. Won't you come? As together we stand and sing.
Someday you'll stand at the bar